now that there's oxygen and then still CO2 around, the real plant life on land and stuff begins to form. But it just says that plant life was there in the form of algae. So that's the end of the third day of land, sea being made with plants, which keeps with Genesis too. Then there's the sun and the moon on the fourth day. This one it's a little hard to understand because you're like, well, how did the plant life happen? Weren't you just talking about the sun and all this? Yeah, that is a little confusing, but let me get to that. It says they were made, but obviously they're already there. But what it says is, let them be for lights in the firmament of the heavens to give light on earth. Meaning, let them be for the purpose of light. It's noting a change in the use of the sun's light. Before the ozone layer was harmful. Now, if there does exist an ozone layer, it becomes a good thing. It's made to be used for its light. So they weren't made here, but they were. Its purpose was finally coming into fruition. And even more on that, they say that the Hebrew phrase for the word that was used here in the original scripts for saying let there be, it really meant like let it be seen, meaning it's revealed. It wasn't something new, but was something that was being revealed, And also goes on to say there that this was kind of the thinning of the atmosphere so that you could see the moon and the sun. Before it was so thick and just dark that you couldn't, whereas now you could. So it wasn't them being made as much as it was them just being revealed. And then that was the end of the fourth day. And the fifth day, it's fish and birds. This is kind of a stretch, but bear with me. And then it says, God says, let the waters abound with abundance of living creatures, and let the birds fly above the earth across the face of the firmament of the heavens. And this is exactly what happens. There was let it abound with an abundance of living creatures. That's what happened. It was called the Cambrian explosion, where just life just took off and exploded in the ocean. I love that part because that is exactly what happened. There was an abundance. I think it is interesting too that obviously there wasn't fish and birds at the same time, but I think it's interesting that in that verse they put fish and birds together because as evolution says, fish evolved into amphibians, which evolved into reptiles, which evolved into birds. So I think that's kind of why they did that. The thing is with Genesis is how would they have known all this? There's no way to have known that. But they did. And that was the end of the fifth day, and then there's animals and man, the last day. And this was about 350 million years ago. Then God says once again, let the earth bring forth the living creatures. He didn't make them new, he brought them out of the earth. He had the earth make them, in my opinion, via evolution. Yeah, and then evolution would go on to say that now that you had the fish, they would turn into amphibians to reptiles. And then some older reptiles evolved from the first mammals, like therapsids, which are kind of like big rodents. And from there branched off into all other mammals, land living creatures. And so at this point, man appears around 100,000 to 400,000 years ago in the form of Neanderthals. And, about 40,000 years ago, he disappears and replaced by the Ice Age Cro-Magnons. And then about 110,000 BC, Ice Ages retreat. Nomads start raising sheep and cattle in about 9,000 BC, replacing hunter-gatherer societies. And then it says nomads arrive in Iraq. Agriculture then arises in the Jordan Valley, which replaces the nomadic hunter-herders. And then they start making bread, and that's been called like the staff of life because it changed everything almost. And I thought this was interesting. Some even say like the story of Cain and Abel was not only just more about the themes that it had in there to teach, but was also kind of an allegory for what happened here. Like Cain the farmer slays Abel the herder, and that's kind of what happened. Is that it started off with people herding animals, but then once agriculture came in, it was just so much easier, and it took over and it dominated it. So some say that's kind of almost like a metaphor of what happened. But yeah, I just wanted to share that because it shows how Genesis is in line with science. Like it's the same story. There's no way they could have known that that was the actual history, and especially the part that light and darkness came first, because it really did. Like, let there be light. That was the first thing, and that was the first thing, and then everything else came from light, and that's insane. Just because light was the beginning of everything. It all started as light, or even light if you think about it. Think about it. The sun was made billions of years ago by particles that eventually turned into a star, which became the sun. Now the sun gives off light and travels to the earth in about 8 minutes, travels down to plants that take that energy and convert it into something physical, their plant food, and then say an animal comes along and eats that plant. Well, now it's imbued with this energy from the sun, basically, that it's made physical. It's made this light physical, and we eat that for life. That's where we get life from. Even if a woman, eats plants and animals, you ever think about the body she creates in her womb? If she's pregnant, is made from those plants and animals. Like, it's literally taken from those nutrients and those proteins to make that body. And if you trace that down the food chain, it all starts with the sun, which was light, which came from the Big Bang. And that's why I use the phrase the source. And yeah, I did. I kind of stole that from the Matrix a little bit, because it kind of makes sense. Like, if you trace everything back, it all comes back to what caused the Big Bang and that first initial flash of light. It's the source of everything good. And on that same page, I mean, the fact that life, like, you think about what soil is. Soil is just dead things that have died and oxidized and release CO2, and the plants take that CO2 and they make it oxygen for living things to breathe. And even animals, and what we do is we steal life from what's already living for us to live. You can't survive and not kill something. Even vegans, you're still killing a plant to eat. You're still taking life from that plant so that you can live. Find me a way where you don't have to kill something to survive. I would be really surprised. That's what we do. We eat the dead and make it live again through us, basically. Something else I wanted to mention in the science community is something called the second law of thermodynamics. And what it basically says is that higher systems will always break down into lower systems. Saying if you got like a rock, eventually that rock's going to go through erosion and it's going to decay. Lower systems will never go into higher systems, but that's basically what all of creation suggests. I mean, this is a law of physics here, basically. That doesn't make any sense, because that's exactly what the Big Bang creation theory and all of evolution suggest, is that a lower system turned into something more complicated. Ordo ab chaos, basically, the order from chaos. This works well for like microevolution, like things like resistant bacteria and stuff like that, but it doesn't make any sense for macroevolution. It doesn't. And on that note, I can't even begin to understand how someone could believe that inorganic, inanimate material, given any amount of time, can rearrange itself to one day contemplate itself. That doesn't just make any sense. There was something that happened there. I mean, also, like I said earlier, considering that to build a cell, you need things to build a cell that are already in the cell. Like, only a thing which had those could make that thing. Basically, to make DNA, you already have to have DNA. It has to come from something. It has to come from some source. It cannot be made new. And it amazes me the perfect conditions that it took for all this to happen. Take the Big Bang, for example. If the Big Bang occurred, it did occur at a perfect rate of expansion, and with just the right amount of energy, because if it had happened and it had been too weak, everything would have collapsed before forming, because gravity would have all pulled it back together, and it just would have came crashing back together. If it was too strong and would have kind of blasted out too heavily, everything would have been strewn apart too far away for gravity to kind of bring it all together and make those gases and make those stars and galaxies. And you have things like the Earth being at the perfect distance from the sun to be able to keep liquid water, which is obviously crucial for life. If it was any closer to the sun, the water would just turn to a gas and evaporate. it was any further away, the water would just freeze. We'd be like one of those ice planets. If the Earth rotated even slightly slower, one side of the Earth would freeze and the other would burn. It moves in such a way that it so perfectly regulates its own temperature. That's what that rotation's for. And to also produce winds, which do things like scatter seeds and regulate temperature. And the special tilt it has, that's needed. That's so that we have seasons. I mean, that slight little tilt gives us seasons. And it's interesting that the moon also actually kind of stabilizes that rotation. So we're really dependent on the moon. And another thing about the moon is just the mind-boggling fact. It's synchronous rotation that it has, so that we only see one side of it as it goes around us. That How does that happen? How does that happen? That has to be specifically made to be like that. And oh yeah, if the planet were any smaller, we wouldn't be able to have an atmosphere due to gravity, because it wouldn't really hold. It wouldn't regulate the gases like it needs to. If it was larger, we would retain like too much of those harmful gases, and they'd become trapped, and we'd have like this horrible smog for an atmosphere. If it was smaller, it just wouldn't hold any of it in, and if it was bigger, it would hold too much of it in, too much of the bad stuff. Another thing that is really stupid, but it doesn't really make any sense why water would become less dense when it freezes and becomes solid. Because it becomes solid, you would think that that would be heavier and more denser. But what's funny is that if it wasn't less dense, then the ice caps would sink and displace the water level, and we'd have horrible flooding everywhere. But that works out just perfectly so that it doesn't. Some scientists aren't even exactly sure how the moon got there. That's an odd thing on its own. But it's necessary for things like regulating the rotation and the Earth's tide, and that syncing up of how it rotates, that just gets me. That still blows my mind. Like how it does it so perfectly that it always perfectly looks at us with just one face. It's crazy. Everything's just too perfect by chance. And there's a thing they have that's called the anthropic principle, which, as far as I can understand, it basically states that we are here to observe. The universe was perfectly made for us, because if it wasn't, we wouldn't be here to make that observation. Meaning, it only seems like it's perfect to us because we are here looking at it. If it wasn't, there'd be nobody to even ask that question. And then, they say that life probably is on other planets, but with the way light works and travels, it would take thousands of years. Even if there was, we wouldn't be able to see it, because we looked out in a telescope, we're really just looking into the past. If we looked at this distant planet with a telescope, to us it may seem like just a bare rock, but that's the past. So it really could have evolution could have occurred, or whatever could have occurred. And it could have a whole thriving society on it, but we wouldn't know. And the thing is just like it's like that way for us, it's the same way for them. They can't see us, and we can't see them. It just won't happen. Point is, we're a special creation. We are unique. There's no way it was just a one in a Google chance. It's just there's no way. We are definitely a statistical improbability, but it's obviously not impossible because we're here. We were made. We were created. It was by something intelligent. It was by intelligent design. I see no other alternative except for to accept that we are just a random occurrence. Don't you ever have that thought or think about that? Like truly, or are you sitting in this moment right now? Or are you just a random chance? Why? Why all this crazy stuff? Why clothes? Why this form? Just everything. It doesn't make sense. The point is that nothing really does make sense without God. But when you involve God and you put God in the equation, most everything does make sense. Suddenly everything does have a reason. It has a purpose. It has an answer. Thank you guys for watching.